I did have some reservation about the name. I said, my God, I mean, that name as a title?
For a long time, people said, oh, you're doing the next James Bond movie. What's the name of it? And I said, well, I don't know. I don't think they've named it yet.
The lady interviewing me said, what is the title of the next Bond film? And I said, Octopussy. And she blushed, and she said, you have to be joking. And I said, why? What's wrong with Octopussy?
Barry Butters does James Bond, Octopussy. For the most part, For Your Eyes Only was a pretty serious Bond film, and the moments of silliness were more or less confined to the start and end of the film. But with his second James Bond film, Octopussy, John Glenn returns to the comedic and silly tone of the Lewis Gilbert era. So I'd say this film rivals Moonraker as one of the most camp and silly Bonds of the entire franchise. We have moments where Roger Moore's directly playing up to the camera. We got tons of sexual innuendo, and we got gadgets galore again. So whereas the previous film represented a return to Ian Fleming, this film represents a return to Lewis Gilbert. There's also some quite substantial problems with the adaptation and the story this time. But on the plus side, it has some pretty fun ideas and some pretty decent scenes here and there. And it also picks up in the last 40 minutes. So it's not all bad. But why don't we stop beating about the Penelope Smallbush and get stuck into the good stuff? Before we talk about the tone of Octopussy in more detail, I just want to say that I think the Roger Moore films can be split into two distinct periods. And that's the early and the late periods. So what's the difference? Well, I think it's got something to do with this difference between what I call funny silly and silly silly. So what's my definition of funny silly? Well, it's that you have some jokes here and there, but they're kept to a minimum. And I think the first two Roger Moore films are brilliant examples of this. In Live and Let Die and The Man with a Golden Gun, the jokes are quite limited in number, but they're also a very particular type of joke. They're sort of droll quips or clever wordplay.
Well, it's just a hat, darling, belonging to a small-headed man of limited means who lost a fight with a chicken. You mean to say there is no way to trace that bullet? No idea what it went through to get here.
But now we've got to move on to Silly Silly, where the audience gets to enjoy themselves and nothing is really taken very seriously. The comedy also tends to move away from droll quips and clever wordplay towards anything that can make you laugh, such as things like having pigeons that can do double takes. And for me, this is the big distinction between the early Roger Moore films and the later ones. So bearing all this in mind, let's go into a bit more detail about the tone of Octopussy, or why I think Octopussy belongs in the category of silly silly. You've got a fair number of scenes where Moore is deliberately playing up to the camera.
Forgive my curiosity, but what is that?
That's my little Octopussy.
But in addition to that, we've also got a scene where Bond recognises his own theme tune. So this is the first in-universe use of the Bond theme. And this film's also got more than its fair share of sexual innuendo.
Well, then why don't we meet there later?
Well, I'll change into something less casual.
Oh, yeah, you may need this to play with your asp. Fast. Having problems keeping it up, Q?
I need refilling.
Of course you do.
This film's also got quite a number of comical sound effects. reason this is in the film is because this Indian actor was actually a professional tennis player. I think this next sound effect continues the James Bond fondness for making film references. But this one seems a bit silly and misjudged. And it's mainly because it don't make any sense in this context. Because Bond is actually trying to escape from a massive crowd of enemies at this point. So why would he want to draw attention to himself by screaming at the top of his lungs? But aside from all that, there are at least 4 serious scenes.
I traced Smythe to Sri Lanka, faced him with the facts, and gave him 24 hours to clear up his affairs before I took him back.
He committed suicide rather than face the disgrace of a court-martial.
What's the connection?
He was my father.
He was alive when I found him.
Did he say anything?
All he said was it was Kamal's men.
No more problems. Europe will insist on unilateral disarmament, leaving every border undefended for you to walk across at will. And it doesn't matter a damn to you, I suppose, that thousands of innocent people will be killed in that accident of yours. And that's for 009.
But while this film includes quite a few serious scenes, John Glenn moves away from the bastard Bond that we briefly saw in For Your Eyes Only. So there's no equivalent scene to the car push in For Your Eyes Only, or being rough with a woman like he was in The Man with a Golden Gun. So the last film and The Man with a Golden Gun were 2 exceptions. So instead James Bond becomes a bit of a softie again.
Well, they've got a new young unknown actor called Roger Moore playing James Bond.
Before we move on any further, I just got to say something about what was going on behind the scenes at this point. What I mean by this is that Roger Moore had been thinking about throwing in the towel, so they started considering new actors for the role of Bond. They were considering actors like Timothy Dalton and Lewis Collins. They'd even considered American actors like James Brolin. They even went as far as recording a screen test for James Brolin, where he reenacted a famous scene from Russia with Love.
In the early 80s, I got a call from Cubby Broccoli with an invitation to come over to London and test for the next Bond film, Octopussy.
Just like your photograph.
You look even better than yours. Much, much better. In fact, you're one of the most beautiful women I've ever seen.
Thank you. But I think my mouth is too big.
It's just the right size. For me, that is.
But all of this changed when a rival production company produced another James Bond film in the same year. And as we all know, that was Never Say Never Again, starring this other bloke who you might have heard of, Sean Connery. And not surprisingly, that sent Eon Productions into a panic, and they eventually managed to persuade Moore to sign on for another James Bond film. By the way, I should also probably mention that the bloke who wrote the story for Never Say Never Again was none other than Kevin McClory. And of course we talked about him in the last review, the bloke who was involved in a long-standing legal dispute with Eon Productions. I do also plan to review Never Say Never Again at some point, but probably not until I've finished with the Eon films. Like the previous film, I'd say Octopussy has a slightly different look and feel compared to earlier James Bond films. Sometimes by comparison it feels slightly cheap and tacky. I think some of this has to do with the absence of Ken Adam, because with this film and the previous film, Peter Lamont is the production designer, so the brilliantly designed sets of the earlier James Bond films are missing at this point. So it feels a bit to me like Bond's lost some of its sheen and glamour. Now a young person who don't know their arse from their elbow might say what's so great about Ken Adam, and I don't really know how to answer that in words, so I'll just let the sets speak for themselves. funny thing about this film is that Bond don't wear quite so many different suits this time, but we got quite a nice pinstripe and a cream suit, and for the first time we see Bond in both a black and a white DJ. But despite not wearing quite so many suits this time, they really go to town on the disguises. First of all, Bond disguises himself in the opening pre-credit sequence as an army officer. But then later on in the film, Bond disguises himself as a gorilla and then as a clown, and I sort of always interpret this as a sort of nod to the audience, that Moore's Bond ain't to be taken too seriously. In fact, we also saw this sort of nod to the audience in the first Roger Moore film.
Roger had some reservations about, putting the red nose on and all that stuff. And I said, oh no, it is a great disguise, isn't it? We had quite a serious discussion about it, and I said, no, it'll be great.
He certainly had great fun romping around in that clown costume.
Bond also dresses up as a sort of circus employee, and then he also dresses up as a knife thrower. Then I think you could say you got one more disguise, although I think you could also say that this should come under the category of gadget. And on the subject of gadgets, in contrast to the last film, they make a big return this time. In Q's lab you see a range of gadgets, like this trick rope, this deadly door, and then the homing device that fits inside the Fabergé egg. Plus Bond's got a watch that can detect the location of the homing device. And then Q also gives Bond this pen that's filled with acid. And Bond can also look at video footage on his watch. But again, Bond don't smoke this time. Although on one occasion he does light a cigarette for Octopussy. I guess the other thing I should mention at this point is that there's something rather strange and confusing about Bond's firearm this time. Because Bond is actually using a Walther P5 this time, and not his normal Walther PPK. The reason why the Walther P5 appears in Octopussy is because the use of the gun was to appease Walther, who wanted Eon to promote this new gun. So the thing is, Bond loses his pistol shortly after he arrives in India, and if you blink you'll miss it. But if we slow the film down, I think you can see it quite clearly. But the thing is, this is actually a Walther P5. But Bond subsequently tells Q that he's mislaid his PPK.
I have also mislaid my PPK.
Anything else?
And then later on in the film, after Bond has been rearmed, he's also seen using the Walther P5 again. So basically it seems like an attempt to appease the gun manufacturer by using a different gun, while pretending to the audience that it was still the Walther PPK. And I think the idea was that they thought no one would notice. Then you got lots of nice Bond girls again. First of all, you got this girl called Karina in the pre-credit sequence. Then you got this girl called Magda.
Forgive my curiosity, but what is that?
That's my little Octopussy.
And then you got the main Bond girl, Octopussy.
Good evening. I wondered when you might arrive.
And this, of course, sees the return of Maud Adams, the girl from The Man with a Golden Gun. But one of the strange things is that I'd say Maud Adams' performance in The Man with a Golden Gun is a lot better than her performance in Octopussy.
Name your price, anything, I'll pay it. You can have me too if you like.
But for now, I think we can also notice that this is a more age-appropriate romance this time, after Bond was paired with much younger women in the previous film. I think another strange thing about Octopussy is that there's a sort of confusion about who's the main antagonist. Is it General Orlov or is it Kemal Khan? Because the thing is, General Orlov dies first. Normally in Bond films, the main villain dies in the last 10 minutes or so. but General Orloff dies around the 1 hour and 40 minute mark, but that's actually a full half hour before the film ends. But the thing is, General Orloff is the main mastermind behind the whole plot. I think the thing is, Khan should have died earlier, and that Bond should have gone after General Orloff at the end instead. This sort of confusion actually lasts to this day, because on Twitter or X very recently I saw this post from the official James Bond account, and this listed General Orloff as the main antagonist. But then lots of people in the comments were arguing it was Camel Khan, so there you go. But for the purposes of this review, I'll side with the comments section and say that Camel Khan is the main antagonist. Yeah, so after all that preamble, we got Bond again as a symbol of good and Camel Khan as a symbol of evil. In terms of the supporting characters, you've only got one scene with Moneypenny this time, and she's accompanied by a glamorous young assistant.
What can I say, Moneypenny, except that she is as attractive and as charming.
As I used to be?
I didn't say that.
Oh, you're such a flatterer, James.
Oh, Moneypenny, you know there never has been, and there never will be anybody but you.
I was a little, sort of annoyed until I found that she was James Clavell's daughter, and her mother was April Stride, who had been a model with me in London when we were about 18. Take one. Roger came in the door. He said, "Oh, you're not Miss Moneypenny." And I said, "Let me introduce you to my new assistant, Miss Penelope Smallbush." Whereupon Roger tossed the carnations. He said, "My God, Moneypenny, I know where your mind is at."
In the last film, of course, we didn't have a scene with M. Instead, we had the Minister of Defence, Sir Frederick Grey, and the MI6 Chief of Staff, Bill Tanner. But in this film, the actor Robert James Brown is cast in the role of M.
They're priceless and very rare. This one contains a model of the Imperial State Coach.
Top marks, 007.
Thank you, sir.
Except it's a fake.
We have, of course, seen this actor before in the James Bond franchise. He was in The Spy Who Loved Me as Admiral Hargreaves.
Commander Bond, sir. Mr. Frederick Grey, Minister of Defence.
Morning, Commander.
Admiral Hargreaves, Flag Officer Submarines.
Ark Royal, wasn't it?
Yes, sir.
And Robert James Brown gets a fair amount of screen time. He sees Bond again after the auction at Sotheby's, then later on when Bond travels to the circus in East Germany. And old Q gets quite a lot of screen time too. He appears in the lab in India, in the background briefly when VJ is giving Bond a massage, then again by the water near Octopussy's island, and at the end again with Bond in an hot air balloon.
What are you doing? Yeah. Oh, cut it out. We haven't time for that. Later, perhaps.
And there's no Felix Leiter again, which makes this the 5th absence in a row. But we do get a Felix Leiter replacement in this film, and that's VJ.
Game, set, and match!
And as in the previous film, the Bond girl also functions as an ally and a lover. And in time-honoured fashion, we get most of the same set pieces. You get the old fist fights, this time with a metal yo-yo thrown in. And we also get another sword fight in this film.
Excuse me.
And then you got the car chase.
Hang on, James!
Suddenly, completely spontaneous and unrehearsed, a local on a bicycle went right between the swordplay and went through unscathed without even looking left or right. He thought conditions were normal.
And you've got a nice little gunfight, where Bond uses the Walter P5, of course, not the PPK. Then you've got a pretty nifty daring escape, where Bond uses one of his gadgets. And then you've got a very spectacular explosion in the opening pre-credit sequence. Beautiful. And then you've got a nice little sex scene. With Octopussy, we get the biggest and most elaborate pre-credit sequence that we've seen so far. We've seen James Bond pilot a plane before. In You Only Live Twice, Sean Connery had Little Nelly, and Roger Moore had a seaplane back in The Man with a Golden Gun. But this one I think has to take the biscuit. I'd say you've got Top Gun levels of aerial acrobatics this time. Immediately after the pre-credit sequence, we see these two assassins called Mishka and Grishka, who are chasing this circus clown who's carrying a Fabergé egg. And then this bloke stumbles about and dies, and he falls through the window of this residence of a British ambassador, and he dies. So this is a pretty strange and confusing start to a James Bond film. But things start to get a little clearer once we go to London and we see M talking to Bond. M tells Bond that the Fabergé egg is a fake, and that he also suspects the involvement of the Soviet Union. M then also tells Bond that the real Fabergé egg is about to be auctioned at Sotheby's, and he wants Bond to identify the buyer. Bond is also informed that the bloke who was dressed up as a clown and died in East Germany was a British agent, 009. But before we go to the auction, we get a scene in Russia, and we see the warmongering General Orlov propose a full-scale attack on Western Europe.
Madness. We know where it will end. NATO will counterattack with nuclear weapons.
Never! The West is decadent and divided. It has no stomach to risk our atomic reprisals.
And I've got to say, this all reminds me of Vladimir Putin a bit. And I'm not the only one. Back in 2022, there was an article in the Express newspaper, and Michael Wilson, who was the executive producer on Octopussy, made this same point when he said that Octopussy predicted the Russian invasion of Europe 4 decades before it happened. At the auction, Bond switches the real egg for the fake egg, and he forces the buyer, this bloke called Camel Khan, to pay $500,000 for the counterfeit. After that, Bond follows Camel Khan back to his home in India. Bond and Khan meet up again and they have a game of backgammon. And when they decide to play for money, Bond uses the real Fabergé egg as a wager. During this game, Bond manages to figure out that Khan is using loaded dice, and he uses these dice himself and wins at backgammon. Khan then sends his bodyguard, Gobinder, after Bond. But with the help of his ally Vijay, Bond manages to escape after a taxi chase and fleeing through a marketplace. Bond then meets up with Q, who fits out the Fabergé egg with a bug and a tracking device. Camel Khan then makes a third attempt to get hold of the real Fabergé egg by using his glamorous female associate called Magda. Now Bond allows Magda to seduce him and steal the egg. He does it on purpose so he can use the tracking device. But unfortunately at this point, Gobinder knocks him out and takes Bond to Khan's palace. After they have a revolting dinner together, Bond manages to escape using a pen that was given to him by Q. And this one's filled with acid. By the way, I've sometimes wondered whether this dinner scene in Octopussy was what inspired the very similar scene in Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, because that came out only 1 year later.
Ah, dessert. Chilled monkey brain.
After Bond escapes, he then uses his listening device, and he discovers all sorts of dirty little secrets. He finds out that Khan actually works for a corrupt Soviet general called Orlov. We also find out more of the details behind the counterfeiting scam. Basically, Orlov has been giving Khan all sorts of Soviet treasures. Khan then produces a counterfeit of these treasures, and Orlov takes the counterfeits back to the Kremlin. Meanwhile, Khan has been smuggling the real treasures back into Europe using the cover of Octopussy Circus. So naturally, Bond's next port of call is Octopussy's palace. But immediately when Bond and Octopussy come face to face, she reveals that they got a personal connection. Octopussy reveals that her late father was Major Dexter Smythe, and this is where the filmmakers make use of the material from the short story Octopussy.
Depends how much you tell me about jewelry smuggling, and why one of our agents was killed in East Berlin.
I know nothing about that. You remember Major Dexter Smythe?
Yes, Smythe, after a brilliant military career, was seconded to our Secret Service. His mission was to recover a cache of Chinese gold seized in North Korea.
He committed suicide rather than face the disgrace of a court-martial.
What's the connection?
He was my father.
I've never really been a fan of how they immediately segue into Octopussy's backstory at this point. It seems a bit clumsy from a storytelling perspective. It's basically like an exposition dump where they shove lots of story elements from the source material in a way that seems very forced and abrupt. I think it would have worked better if they built up to it slowly, and not have it so Octopussy says everything at once, but rather that she reveals things slowly as she gets to know Bond. Octopussy then invites Bond to be her guest at her palace, but Camel Khan has another go at killing Bond. He pays some assassins to kill him. But working together, Bond and Octopussy manage to see off the assassins. Although unfortunately later on when Bond returns to Q, he finds that the assassins have killed VJ. Meanwhile back in Russia, General Gogol figures out what Orlov's been up to. He finds out about the jewellery smuggling and the use of counterfeits. At this point Bond travels to East Germany, because when he was listening to General Orlov's conversation with Khan, he heard that they were going to meet at Karl-Marxstadt in East Germany, and this is where the circus is also scheduled to perform. And when he arrives at the circus in East Germany, Bond starts to put all the pieces of the puzzle together. He finds out that General Orlov has replaced the jewels with a nuclear warhead, and it's time to explode at the next circus performance at the United States Air Force Base in West Germany. Bond also manages to get to the art of the devious plan. Because the bomb would explode at the US Air Base, everyone would conclude that this was an accident. Europe would then get rid of all their nuclear weapons, and that would then allow the Russians to invade Europe. After a little shootout, Bond takes General Orlov's car. General Orlov then chases after Bond, but he's killed by some guards when he tries to rush a checkpoint. After Bond manages to board the moving circus train, he gets into a bit of a scuffle and he falls off the train again. After being separated from the train, he manages to hike a lift from this couple, and he's on his way to the airbase. But then he also has to steal a car to complete the rest of his journey. Along the way, I've been making quite a few criticisms of this film, but I have to say the last 40 minutes or so are pretty good. The tension builds very nicely with Bond struggling to get to the circus after being thrown off the train. Eventually Bond reaches the army base and he disguises himself as a clown, because at this point the West German police are on his tail. Bond eventually manages to locate the bomb and he defuses it just in time. He also informs Octopussy that Khan betrayed her. Meanwhile, Khan is returned to his palace in India. And Bond and Octopussy return to India to intercept. Octopussy leads a ground assault while Bond and Q arrive by hot air balloon. Meanwhile, the rest of Octopussy's girls manage to overpower Khan's guards, but at this point Khan and Gobinder have escaped on horseback, and they've also got Octopussy with them. But this is where Bond comes back in the picture. As they're making their escape, Bond rushes the plane on horseback, and he manages to jump onto the plane just as it's about to take off. He also manages to disable one of the engines, as well as the elevator panel. Khan then sends Gobinder out on the wing to fight Bond. And after a brief scuffle, Gobinder falls to his death. The plane then temporarily lands and Bond manages to rescue Octopussy. And moments later we see Khan crash into the side of the mountain. We then briefly cut to England and we see the Minister of Defence talking to Gogol. And they're talking about returning the stolen jewels to the Kremlin. And then the film closes out with Bond and Octopussy having a bit of a kiss and a cuddle on her private galley back in India.
I'm Octopussy. Let me tease you with a peek at the next and most fabulous Bond of all.
So with the character of Octopussy, we again get a substantial three-dimensional Bond girl. But while I'd say the character is pretty decent, I'd say the performance leaves a little bit to be desired. And of course I'm talking about Maud Adams at this point. The thing is, I think her performance in The Man with the Golden Gun was pretty decent, but for whatever reason I don't really think she does so well in this film. So I want to talk about Maud Adams in Octopussy in more detail by doing a performance comparison. So I think in this scene from The Man with a Golden Gun, Maud Adams conveys a range of complex and believable emotions.
You don't walk out in Scaramanga. There's no place you wouldn't find me.
You need a good lawyer.
I need 007. Who do you think sent that bullet to London with your number on it? I want him dead. Name your price, anything, I'll pay it. You can have me too if you like.
For my money, this is a very convincing portrayal of a woman in distress. There's also a very nice little touch in this performance, because just before she makes her sexual proposal to Bond, she acts all coy and embarrassed. And this element of her performance makes the character much more believable. So she comes into the room feeling fearful and desperate, and she implores Bond to help her in a difficult situation in which she finds herself. But then when she lays her cards out on the table and offers sexual favours in return, she obviously also feels embarrassed. And I think Maud Adams does an absolutely brilliant job in this scene of conveying this range of emotions. Now I'd say the equivalent scene in Octopussy is very weak.
There are vast rewards for a man of your talents willing to take risks.
I'm not for hire.
Oh, a man of principle, with a price on his head. Naturally, you do it for Queen and country. I have no country, I have no price on my head.
I don't believe the scene as much as I did with the equivalent scene in The Man with the Golden Gun. So why is her performance so much worse? Well, I think there could be a number of reasons. It could have something to do with the director not offering sufficient guidance, or it could simply be they didn't do enough takes. I think also the lines aren't so great, so I think it's not scripted as well as the equivalent scene in The Man with the Golden Gun. So in order to be fair to Maud Adams, I think we got to talk about some of the problems with the lines and the script as well. Because it don't really make a lot of sense that she should be this upset after Bond refuses to work for her organisation. In fact, it also seems very naive of her to have this expectation in the first place, given the fact that he's an highly trained MI6 agent who works for the British government. I think it would have made a lot more sense if she'd still been angry with Bond about him being responsible for her father's death. And then they could have taken things more slowly, so that over the course of the film she ends up falling in love with Bond. And if the romance took longer to develop, it would have seemed more believable. and they would have been able to explore the tensions between Octopussy's resentment of Bond and her dawning affections for him. With this sort of treatment, it would have been very similar to the sort of emotional turmoil that we saw with Tanya in From Russia With Love. The thing is, if you listen to Maud Adams in the interviews, she seems like a very thoughtful and intelligent person.
I didn't really understand until the day of the screen test that they were serious about me playing Octopussy. I did have some reservation about the name. I said, my God, I mean, that name as a title?
And Roger Moore also spoke very highly of her.
The things I've always said about Maud, it was always calm, always ready, very pleasant to work with.
But the thing is, Maud Adams ain't the only Bond girl to give a wooden performance in this film. Yeah, so now we got to talk about Magda. I don't know if it's just me, but there's something about this Bond girl that is pretty fucking weird. Sometimes she pulls these facial expressions that makes it seem like she's from another planet. And she has such a strange delivery of various lines. She seems sort of faltering or dazed or confused, like she's on drugs or something, and she's got lots of jerky eye movements. I think it probably comes down to the fact that she's not receiving enough direction about what her character is trying to convey.
Something like that. It's for my scrapbook. I collect memories.
Huh? The scene when they're in bed together also has its fair share of weird moments. Just pay close attention to the movement of her mouth. So in general, I'd say the old Bond girl thing is very weak this time around. The only good thing really is that it's more age appropriate, unlike the last film.
No! God, please, no! 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 No!
Now normally at this point I'd say something about the Bond girl in the short story, but in this case the Bond girl in the short story is an octopus.
Hello, darling. My next leading lady.
The first thing to say about the adaptation is that it uses the same strategy as the previous film, and this strategy involves merging two stories and then adding some original material. But I'd say Octopussy don't do this quite so well as For Your Eyes Only. So the two short stories in question this time are Octopussy and The Property of a Lady. The material they use from the short story Octopussy is basically confined to one scene of the film, and that's the scene in the film where Maud Adams goes into the history of her character's backstory. So the short story Octopussy begins with this bloke called Dexter Smythe and his pet octopus in the sea, and he calls this pet octopus Pussy. Yeah, so have a look at this. This is near the start of the story. The eye in the mottled brown sack was still watching him carefully from the hole in the coral, but now the tip of a single small tentacle wavered hesitatingly an inch or two out of the shadows, and quested vaguely with its pink suckers uppermost. Dexter Smythe smiled with satisfaction. Given time, perhaps 1 month on top of the two during which he had been chumming up with the octopus, and he would have tamed the darling, but he wasn't going to have that month. Should he take a chance today and reach down and offer his hand, instead of the expected lump of raw meat on the end of his spear to the tentacle? Shake it by the hand, so to speak. No, Pussy, he thought. I can't quite trust you yet. So all of that is pretty bloody weird. But there you go, that's what Ian Fleming is like some of the time. But we then learn that Dexter Smythe is about to be escorted back to England. We then get a flashback to a few days earlier where James Bond turned up at his house. For only a couple of hours earlier, Major Dexter Smythe's already dismal life had changed very much for the worse. And then in the next paragraph it explains, and all of this because of a man called Bond, Commander James Bond, who had turned up at 10:30 that morning in a taxi from Kingston. We then get a brief scene between James Bond and Smythe was about to light James Bond's cigarette, and it goes, "It's alright, thanks." James Bond had already lit his cigarette. "No, it's nothing local. I want to..." I've been sent out to ask you to recall your work for the service at the end of the war." James Bond paused and looked down at Major Smythe carefully. Over the course of the story, we find out that Smythe had smuggled Nazi gold out of Austria and then fled to Jamaica after the end of the Second World War. In the film, of course, they changed some of these details, so there ain't a German connection in the film. Instead, Smythe smuggles the gold out of North Korea, and in the film, of course, they give him a daughter. In the short story, James Bond reveals that the man he robbed and killed in Austria was his former ski instructor, and that Bond had accepted this case because of its personal connection. Later on, when everything's come to light, Major Smythe asks Bond why he's got mixed up in the whole thing. And it goes, James Bond looked Major Smythe squarely in the eyes. "It just happened that Oberhauser was a friend of mine. He taught me to ski before the war, when I was in my teens. He was a wonderful man. He was something of a father to me, at a time when I happened to need one." "Oh, I see." Major Smythe looked away. "I'm sorry." A modified version of this backstory is also used in the film Spectre, which came out in 2015.
You probably know that James here lost his parents when he was young. But did you know that it was my father who helped him through this difficult time? Over the course of 2 winters, he taught him to ski.
So, you killed him?
Yes, I did. Franz Oberhauser died 20 years ago, James.
During their meeting, Bond informs Smythe that they're going to take him back to England. But Bond also gives Smythe a week's notice so that he can get his affairs in order. So after this, Smythe is left pondering his options. He considers fighting the case in court, and then he also considers suicide. But before any of that can happen, he's actually killed by his pet octopus. The octopus quietly, relentlessly pulled downwards, and a terrible realisation came to Major Smythe. He summoned his dregs of strength and plunged his spear down. The only effect was to push the scorpionfish into the mass of the octopus and offer more arm to the octopus. The tentacle snaked upwards and pulled more relentlessly. Too late, Major Smythe scrabbled away his mask. One bottled scream burst out across the empty bay. Then his head went under and down, and there was an explosion of bubbles to the surface. Then Major Smythe's legs came up, and the small waves washed his body to and fro, while the octopus explored his right hand with its buccal orifice, and took a first tentative bite at a finger with its beak-like jaws. Yeah, so there you go. Old Smythe comes to a very grisly end. And in addition to that, they borrow one scene idea from The Property of a Lady, which is the other short story. And the scene I'm talking about in this case is the auction scene. So the short story, The Property of a Lady, begins with James Bond in his office on a slow work day, but he's then called into M's office. M introduces Bond to this bloke called Dr. Fanshawe, who's an authority on antique jewellery. Yeah, so have a look at this. This is at the start of the short story, and this is when Bond and M are in conversation. M said Dr. Fanshawe is a noted authority on antique jewellery. He is also, though it is confidential, advisor to HM Customs and to the CID on such things. He has in fact been referred to me by our friends at MI5. It is in connection with our Miss Freudenstein. Bond raised his eyebrows. Maria Freudenstein was a secret agent working for the Soviet KGB in the art of the Secret Service. She was in the communications department, but in a watertight compartment of it that had been created especially for her. Then over the page it says, M turned to Dr. Fanshawe. Perhaps, Doctor, you would care to tell Commander Bond what it is all about? Certainly, certainly. Dr. Fanshawe looked quickly at Bond and then away again. He addressed his boots. You've heard of a man called Fabergé, no doubt, famous Russian jeweller. And Bond goes, made fabulous Easter eggs for the Tsar and Tsarina before the revolution. That was indeed one of his specialities. He made other exquisite pieces of what we may broadly describe as the objects of virtue. Today in the sales rooms, the best examples fetch truly fabulous prices, 50 grand and more. And recently there entered this country the most amazing specimen of all, the so-called emerald sphere. In the short story, it's Em who thinks this must have something to do with Russian espionage. So when Bond attends the auction, he manages to identify the KGB bloke. The hair grew low down on the back of the man's rather squat neck, and the lobes of his ears were pinched in close to his head. He had a slight hump, perhaps only a bone deformation, high up on his back. Bond suddenly remembered. This was Peter Malinowski. So the auction scene and the Fabergé egg from this short story are obviously in the film. In fact, this is a very engaging short story, and it's actually much better in my opinion than Octopussy. It's probably one of my favourite of Ian Fleming's short stories.
Yours, sir. £500,000.
I was very proud of Octopussy. I thought we put in all the right ingredients. We outgrossed the other Bond film, which was satisfying to some degree.
Now I'll let you into a little secret. Octopussy is one of the few James Bond films that I don't actually enjoy. As I said before near the start of this review, I think this film suffers from a sort of loss of sheen or glamour. And I said this had something to do with the departure of Ken Adam, and I think for whatever reason you feel it more in this film than you did in the last film. This film also suffers from an excessive reliance on comedy. The funny thing is that with his first film, John Glenn seemed to have quite a distinct vision, but in this film it just feels like he's copying the work of his predecessor. And that's Lewis Gilbert, of course. But I think the other problem at this stage is that Roger Moore is also starting to look too old for the role of Bond. And in addition to that, I think his light-hearted take on the role is getting a bit tired at this point. And they've also almost run out of Fleming material. Now this weren't actually so much of a problem in the last film, because it was a very skillful blending of two short stories. But I feel like the adaptation is not so clever this time, and that the story has consequently got quite a few problems. And the main offence in this regard is cramming all of Octopussy's backstory into one scene. And then I'd say the Bond girl is a bit of a weakness in this film too. So while I like Maud Adams as an actress in general, I don't think she's very good in this film. I just think she don't give a very good performance. And then you've also got a confusion over who's the main antagonist. Is it General Orlov or is it Camel Khan? So when you take all this together, this film feels like a bit of a mess. Nevertheless, as I said before, I do think the last 40 minutes or so are pretty good. I also like a few of the other scenes in the movie, like the auction scene and the pre-credit sequence. So like I said at the start, it's not all bad. So for me, the Bond franchise at this point is a bit like a car that's run out of petrol. It's still going along somehow, but it's chugging along on fumes and an empty tank. Yeah, so there you go, 5 out of 10. And that's the lowest score we've had for quite some time. And as we move forward, we'll just have to see whether Octopussy is the worst Roger Moore film, or the second worst. But I think we can see that a pattern has emerged at this point. So for me, Roger Moore starts out strong, but the longer he stays in the role, the worse it seems to get. And I think it's basically a case of him outstaying his welcome slightly. But for now, it only remains for me to say that that's 13 down and 12 to go. And this is Barry Butters signing out, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Good.